let me go back to your 2008 visit to Israel-Palestine. You wrote this: "For months after my trip to Israel in 2008, I lived with a strange disturbance unlike any I had known after visiting other atrocity sites." And then you go on to say, "The Palestinians under occupation stood so far apart from their persecutors, and I found it unnerving, too, that their persecutors were the West's former victims who now possess the ease and safety of a Western lifestyle on both sides of the wall, dividing Israel from the West Bank." Now, why was this such a turning point for you? And this is something that Ta-Nehisi Coates has also talked about in his book, The Message. It's going from a place where you had this infatuation or reverence for Israel to actually seeing and realizing the reality that the Palestinians face in terms of occupation and everything else. But why was it a turning point?
I think, nothing really actually prepares you just for the sheer hideousness of the structures of occupation in the West Bank. The way in which those structures have been devised, there's something truly fiendish about them, So that comes as a huge shock because, none of the books you've read, none of the films you've seen, none of the documentaries really actually prepare you for this revelation for a place like Hebron, for instance. And also sort of casual abuse. We are now witness over the last 15 months to acts of spectacular violence, that Israel has inflicted on both the West Bank and Gaza. But there is a kind of everyday structural casual violence. And that's something you can only see once you're there. So that was a sort of huge, in a way, shock to many of us who went on that trip. The other thing I would say is that if you go to Israel, having grown up in a post-colonial country, with the narrative of national independence, which is, what is that narrative? The narrative is that the world was divided up by white supremacists into the North and South. The white supremacists exploited these countries mercilessly, ruined their societies, ruined their economies, and people from these societies had to wage a very long battle to get rid of these exploiters from Europe and to send them back to their respective countries. And some of the best people in our countries fought to end racial privilege, fought to end white privilege. If you grow up with that narrative, and then you go to State of Israel and see white racial privilege being so brutally enforced in structures of apartheid in that country, you cannot but be shocked. This is perhaps not a experience that a European will have, because that European has grown up with a very different narrative. That European has grown up with the narrative of the Holocaust. That person will see Israel, as I used to, I still do in many ways, as a country that had to be created in order to house the refugees of the Holocaust. But when I go there and I see the occupation, I'm appalled because I see something that is going on in 2025 that should have stopped in the 1940s, which is Palestine should have been decolonized a long time ago.
One critic may ask you, well, Pankaj, 2008, that was 17 years ago. Why wait till 2025 to have a book like this?
Well, Mohammed, that's really interesting, because I've wanted to write about this issue for a very long time, from the late 90s onwards. And I faced constant discouragement. I think, again, going back to your earlier question.
Sure.
Like, what are the media regimes that we all have to inhabit? If you're a writer from India, you're allocated certain subjects that you should really write about. Occasionally, you'll break out of this little ghetto and attempt something riskier. Those attempts might be accommodated. So if you say, I want to write about China, yes, you can write about China. So I did write about China. China is safer to write about because China is a supposedly enemy country. So whatever you write, obviously it'll be critical of what's going on there in China, and that will be, welcomed. Writing about Israel, of course, puts you in a very delicate territory with editors in the West, because you are going to be critical, obviously, and that criticism is not really truly acceptable coming from people like myself. It's best expressed by American writers or European writers, but I think that's one reason why we haven't had Arab voices in the Western media for a long time. One reason we don't have Palestinian voices is because that kind of criticism is too devastating, it's too upsetting. So, to answer your question, I've tried to write about this subject on numerous occasions, but always discouraged. And there are instances I discuss in the book, too, where people just said I lack credentials, or this is not something we are interested in, although they would commission someone else to write about it. Again, this forms part of a longer history of censorship, of suppression, of propaganda that one day should be written, so we can actually confront the truth about the Western media's coverage of this subject, the extent to which they've lied, they've obfuscated, tried to obscure the clearest, the most visible realities of the occupation and of structural modes of violence. So I wrote about this issue in 2024 when I was asked by the London Review to deliver a lecture, and I thought to myself immediately that I'm going to write about this subject. Here was an opportunity to express many of the things that I'd wanted to express, also bring into play a whole range of my interests and concerns, not just in Jewish history or European intellectual history, but also the intellectual history of places like India, of China. So there's a lot in this book that actually emerges out of long-standing interests and concerns, and it is brought into conversation with this particular subject of Israel.